Good morning, I'm Paula and welcome to Sew Spark Studio. A couple I know has been trying to have a baby for many years now and just recently got the amazing news that they were able to adopt a baby girl. And so it happened quite suddenly, and here I am wanting to make them a quilt for their new baby. So I'm going to do something quite simple, a stylized kind of a watercolor look, I hope, is how it will turn out when I have it all together. And it's giving me a chance to use these fabrics that I bought actually quite a few years ago. And I'm really excited to see how they'll work together in this quilt that I'm going to do. And then I'm going to put a swallow applique on the quilt as well. One of the things swallows represent is hope. And this couple has been hoping for many years for a baby. And it also symbolizes the hopes they will have for their future together. And they're a couple who has a faith in God, and birds are often referenced in the Bible as God cares for the birds and how much more He cares for us. And swallows also symbolize spiritually rebirth and new times ahead, which is so appropriate for this baby and this family. I'm ready to cut my fabrics. And even though this is a very simple quilt, because I've decided to use a lot of different fabrics in it, I've done a fair amount of planning. And so I have here kind of a map of the layout of the quilt and a cutting chart. And these will be available on my website, sewsparkstudio.com, if you want to download them and print them. And to be honest with you, it's a bit of an experiment. So I'm going to be cutting out my blocks and then I'm going to lay them out and see if I like it. And if I don't, I will modify it at that point. I'm using, as I showed you earlier, a package of fabrics that I purchased that were all designed to coordinate with each other. This grouping of fabrics was actually cut in what are called fat quarters. And so this is a fat quarter, which measures 19 inches by 22 inches. So it's about 1/4 of a yard, except it's not the long 1/4 of a yard, it's the fat 1/4 of a yard. And some of these fabrics I've used for another quilt. So I have some that are in the original fat quarter pieces and some that are a little smaller because of another quilt that I made. But what I'm doing is grouping them to try and economize on the number of cuts that I'm making. And so I'm lining up the selvage edge, which is this edge that's a different color over here. I've discovered some of them are directional, meaning there's an upside and a downside on the design on the fabric. And so I'm going to cut all of them directional just to simplify the cutting a little bit. I'm lining up the selvage edge with one of the vertical lines on my cutting mat here. And then on the opposite side of that, I'm going to trim a clean edge with my rotary cutter here. And then I'm going to do a 6.5 inch cut. And my ruler is 6 inches, so the easiest way to do a 6 inch cut is to line up on the 0 line. And then cut at 6.5 inches. And then this is extra fabric in case I need to go back to it. And there are some blocks on this quilt that are not the 4.5 by 6.5. There are some smaller ones because I'm doing a brick pattern where not everything lines up. And so I'm going to cut those after I cut all of the 4.5 by 6.5 cuts. So I've got my 6.5 cut here. And then I take those fabrics, I line them up again with a line on the mat, and I'm going to trim this edge. And then I'll do my 4.5 cut, and I can use the lines on the ruler to do that cut. So this is the finished size of most of the blocks that are in this quilt. And I'm going to cut all of the 4.5 by 6.5 inch blocks now. Then I have some pieces that need to be cut 4.5 inches by 4.5 inches and some that are 2.5 by 4.5 inches. So I'm going to cut those pieces now. All the blocks are now cut, and I also cut an extra block in a few of the colors that the design I created called for. So those are completed. And this is the fabric that I'm using for my border. And I'm doing a very simple border because the center part of the quilt has a lot of different fabrics for it. So this one is cut differently. This is a length of fabric. It's folded in half. These are the selvage edges, the finished edges of the fabric on top of each other, lined up opposite the fold line. And I've got this lined up with a horizontal line on my mat. And I'm going to begin by trimming the end square so that we've got a 90-degree angle here. And I need for the border 4 cuts that are 4.5 inches wide. And so again, I'm just going to use my ruler for those cuts and line up on the 4.5 inch line. This fabric will also be my backing, but I cut that after the top is finished. 2 of these border pieces are 32.5 inches long. So I'm going to start by trimming off the selvage. And again, I have it on a horizontal line here. And I'm going to trim the selvage at a 90-degree angle to that. These 4.5 inch lengths that I cut need to then be cut to the length for the border. So this piece is going to be 32.5 inches long, and there are 2 of these. And then I'll line up and cut out the other 2, which will be 38.5 inches long. So those are my border pieces. And normally I would cut my binding right now as well, but I'm doing something different with the binding. So I'm actually going to wait until I'm done the quilt and ready to do the binding before I cut the pieces for that. I've laid out all the pieces for the top of my quilt, and in the process looked at the colors and where I laid them out, and I did make some changes. I've actually omitted 5 of the fabrics I was going to use and added a few extra squares in some of the colors that I'd already used. And so this would be the bottom of the quilt. This is the top. It's meant to represent kind of a ground, grass, sun, with the types of colors that can happen with sunrise, sunset, and then the sky and clouds at the top. Very conceptual, but I think I've got it to a point where I like how it's going to come together. So now I am ready to begin sewing, and for this quilt, I'm using a neutral thread color, cream or light beige. I don't always use cotton thread when I'm quilting, but I happen to have these spools of Egyptian cotton thread, really good quality. And so even though it's on a serger cone, I don't use it for serging. I use it for when I do quilts. And I have a size 80 needle in a universal point, and I am going to be switching out for my 1/4 inch foot. You can sew without a 1/4 inch foot just by using the lines or finding a line on your machine that is accurate, but it's very easy to sew. It's got a nice little edge on it for lining up your fabrics and getting that accurate seam. And one of the most important things when you're quilting is that you have a really accurate 1/4 inch seam. I'm going to use a modified speed piecing on this. When you're using so many colors in a quilt, it's difficult to truly speed piece, but I'm going to do each row in groups of 2. And with quilting, you don't need to backstitch because you're going to be sewing all these pieces together. And so I'll do my groups of 2, and then I'll sew those groups together to make each row. And because there's 5 pieces across on this quilt, there are only 2 groups of 2. And then I'll take these groups of 2 and sew them together. So I'll be sewing each row together in the same way. After I sewed the first row together, I realized that I got my fabrics out of order, and I also forgot to check the directional print, and I had this particular one upside down. And I thought, well, I could just reshoot the whole thing and, pretend I did it perfectly the first time, but this is life. And the nice thing about sewing is that you can always rip it out and fix it, which I did. And so on to the rest of the quilt. Here are the rows all stitched together, and now we need to do some pressing before moving to actually sewing the rows together. So I'm going to press each row. Now, normally if I was doing squares, pressing is very important in terms of the direction you press, because it makes it easier to sew the rows together. Because this is staggered, I don't have the same seam matching that's going to be happening, but I'm going to follow the same practice that I would use as if I was doing squares. Pressing, so important to quality when you're done a project. Doesn't matter what you're making, clothing, quilts, whatever. And so correct pressing procedure, I've got a cotton setting because I'm using cotton fabrics, and steam, I like steam. And first step, press it the way you sewed it. And what that does is flatten and set your stitches. So I'm just going to quickly do each of the seams on this one. And then I'm going to flip this over, and I'm going to press these all one direction. And in quilting, it's very common that we do not press seams open like we might do in clothing, but we press to one side. You want to make sure that you're pressing nice and even with the edge here. Here, I'll do one wrong and show you what I mean. So what you don't want when you flip it over is you don't want this kind of crease. I really exaggerated it because that's not accurate, right? What I do is I put the iron on it with a little bit of pressure, and then I pull a little bit away from the iron, and that means as I push that seam over that it's nice and flat. And I am pressing, which is more of a holding with some pressure rather than a back and forth like if I was ironing a shirt. And so I'm going to do each of the seams like that. So this is my first row from the bottom of the quilt. When I do the second row, I'm going to do it the opposite direction from the first row. So again, I'm going to start by just pressing each seam, move that one out of the way a little bit here. Press each seam flat. And so then I want to press this the opposite direction from the first row that I did. This row is pressed this direction. This row is going to go the opposite way. So again, same procedure, iron on there. And if you're not comfortable using your other hand, I'm a sort of ambidextrous, you can flip it over once you get started here and then do it this way. If I flip this back the way that it's actually going to be sewn together, what I have is this row goes this direction, this row goes this way. And then I'm going to continue. The next row is going to go the same way as the first row. The fourth row will go the same way as this one, and so on. Everything is now pressed, and I've laid this out upside down so you can see that each of the rows alternates with the direction of the pressing. And now I'm going to start sewing rows together. You'll notice that I have a few pins in my row. And I do that in order to make sure that my ends are going to line up properly. And if you sew accurate seams, that should happen. But, you know, every once in a while, things don't go together quite like you expect. And if I pin it, then I can make sure that it's going to be accurate. If there's any issues, I can fix them. And sometimes I can fix them by doing a little bit of stretching here or there. But this one is fitting together nicely. So now I'm going to sew these together. Again, I'm using a 1/4 inch foot. And as I sew, I'm removing the pins and I'm making sure that the seams stay in the right direction. And I will be sewing the rest of the rows together. I usually sew my rows in groups of 2, and then I'm going to take the 2 groups of 2 here and sew those together, and then I'll sew it together. It just makes it a little easier to work with smaller amounts of fabric as you're working through the rows in the quilt. The rows are all sewed together, and this is ready for pressing the seams that I just sewed. Now when I press the row seams, I usually press them all in one direction, and usually I press them towards the bottom of the quilt. No really right or wrong way to do that. That's just what I typically will do. And so again, pressing as it was sewn to set your stitches and flatten the seams. So I will do all of those. And so once you've flattened all of those, then pressing is similar to how I did it when I was sewing the rows together. I'm going to hold my iron and then pull. Here, I'll move this a bit. I don't think you can see well what I'm doing here. So I'm going to put my iron here, pull a little bit as I push that seam. And I will do that for each of the rows. The blocks are all sewn and it's pressed, and now I'm going to add the swallow design to the top right hand corner. So I'm using this blue fabric, and this is the template that I created for the swallow. So this is the swallow design that I'm going to use. And I am not the kind of artist that can just sit down and draw something out of my head. So I often will Google images, black and white outlines, and then I use that for my inspiration. And if something is more difficult, I may create a graph with 2-inch or 5-centimeter squares and draw lines on a smaller image and then transpose it to a larger one. So I have a variety of ways that I get the images that I use for quilts. And this one is inspired by something I did see online, and then I adapted it to make it work the way I wanted it for my quilt. So this is the black and white outline, and this is the positioning that I want for my finished design on the quilt. And I'm going to be using a fusible web to apply this to the quilt. So when I do that, I actually need a reversed image in order to do the fusing and have it come out the way I want it to come out. And so I will post both of these on my website for you, but this is the reverse of what I actually want. And then I have fusible web. There are a variety of different brands of fusible web out there. This particular one is Wonder Under, and it's my favorite. I've tried some of the others and for various reasons have not loved the results. I'm putting the web with the paper side up over top of the image, and then I'm simply going to trace the outline of the swallow. Now, if you can draw, you could draw right on the web or on the paper side of the web. And so now my swallow is on my fusible web. So we're back at the ironing board, and I've got my traced outline on the fusible web and my fabric. First, I'm actually going to give my fabric a little bit of a press from the wrong side. Now, when I fuse the web, because it's got the paper on there, you actually do not want steam in your iron. So I'm going to turn the steam off on my iron because the steam will wrinkle the paper that's on there. So I'm going to fuse this with a dry iron rather than with steam. And basically for fusing, it's just a matter of holding for about 10 seconds and melting that fusible web onto the back of the fabric that you're going to use. And then once you're done, if you want to check whether the fusing is solid enough, if you go to an edge and peel, the paper should come away and the web should remain on the fabric. And I can feel it's kind of a plasticky feel to it. And so this is fused well enough. Then I'm going to let this cool for a little bit. And then I'm going to cut it out with a pair of scissors. And the nice thing about using fusible web is I'm going to cut the web and the fabric all at the same time. So this is cooled off now, so I'm going to cut it out. And I just use my fabric shears. And the paper that's used for this is quite thin. It's not like cutting a piece of photocopy paper or something like that. So it is fine to use your shears on. You can see now why I traced a reversed image of the bird, because my fusing web is on the back, and when it's actually fused to the quilt top, it's going to be facing the direction that I want it to face. So now I'm going to peel off this fusible web from the back of the fabric. And if you have any trouble peeling this off, it may mean that you need to go back and just put a little more heat on it to make sure that fabric adheres to the web. And so I can feel that web on the back here. It's got a little bit of a plastic feel to it. And then you just position the swallow wherever you want it, if that looks pretty good there. And then you're going to fuse. Now I am going to go back to steam. The paper's gone, so I'm not concerned about that anymore. And steam will help this fuse more securely. And then you will do again 10 seconds with steam so that this is securely adhered. And what this does is just make sure that this stays in position, because I'm also going to sew it. If I was making something that I was going to hang on the wall and would not be washing or manipulating a lot, you could just fuse it and not do anything else to it. But because this is for a baby and it's likely going to get washed and handled, it's going to be more secure if I stitch. So I'm going to use a satin stitch to stitch around the edges and secure it to the fabric. I'm going to use a satin stitch to sew the applique. On my machine, that's this number 8, just a plain zigzag basically. And then the settings I'm going to change. I'm going to change the width to 3. 3 is a very common width that I use depending on the size of the applique. And then the length I need to shorten. It's at 1.5, and I usually use like a 0.5. I've been using the 1/4 inch foot on my sewing machine, so I'm now going to switch that out. And I happen to have an applique foot, and the bottom of this foot has just metal pieces on it, which helps it glide more easily on the fabric. And it's open at the front, so it's easy for me to see what I'm doing. But I have also done a lot of applique just with the regular sewing machine foot that comes with the machine. So you don't need to have that special foot for this if you don't have it. To start the applique, I just find a spot somewhere on my image that has a relatively flat edge, so that when I come around the image and come back to my starting point, it's easy for me to merge with that starting point without a lot of bulk in the fabric. So I'm going to start on the bottom of this. This is a wing right here. I don't know how easily, there you go. So you can see the beak of the bird and the head. And so this is the lower wing. I'm going to start right here. And I usually start with my needle in the fabric. So I'm going to position this. And because I've done a lot of applique, I can estimate quite accurately how much width there's going to be when this starts stitching. And then your presser foot goes down. And when I start again, you don't want a lot of bulk here. So I don't back stitch. I use a lock stitch feature that I have on my sewing machine. On my machine, it's a circle with a dot in it. Here, I'll move this a little bit so you can see it. But this circle with a dot, oops, is a lock stitch. So when I push that, when I go to sew, it is going to essentially sew up and down for about 4 or 5 stitches, almost in exactly the same spot, and lock the stitching, and then it will start doing the zigzag. And now it's doing the zigzag. And you can see I have this positioned so that when the needle comes down on the right side, it is right on the edge of the fabric. So it's basically covering the edge of the fabric. And I've chosen to use a blue thread that's just slightly darker than the swallow fabric that I'm using. Now, when you come to corners or curves, there's a couple different ways you can do it. Sometimes if it's a very gentle curve, I'm able to manipulate the fabric and just do it without doing anything special. But on this one, I'll show you how I use pivoting here. So I come up to where I think I need to start switching. This is an outward curve. Stop with the needle on the right side, lift your foot, pivot just a tiny little bit, and then you're going to take a few more stitches till the next point where you need to pivot. And work your way around accordingly. And I'll show you what I do on an inward curve in just a minute here. So on the inward curve, you want to stop with the needle on the left side, and then you do your pivot the opposite way. Again, just a little pivot. And I'm controlling my speed with my foot. If you have trouble doing that, you can use, if your machine has a speed selector, mine does, but I've done enough sewing that the speed selector is kind of redundant at this point in time because I can do it all with my foot. Now the beak is a small area, so it's a little tricky. So I'm going to carry on with my stitching almost up to the point there. Stopping on the right side, I'm going to pivot a little and do a couple more stitches, actually just 2. And then I'm going to pivot almost in a full turn, but not quite, because I don't want to sew outside of the bird. So I'm going to do a couple stitches like this, actually 4 of them. And then I'm going to carry on. And again, the little turn here, this is the inward curve. Now, when you come up to an actual square kind of corner like there is right here, I'm going to come up to it and then I'm going to stitch past it about 4 stitches. And then I'm going to do a full pivot. And I'm pivoting and seeing that I'm probably going to sew off the bird, so I need to do 2 more stitches. So I'm coming back, 2 more stitches, and now when I sew, it's not going to go off the bird. And so I am going to be overlapping some stitching at this point. And then you just carry on. And there's the swallow all stitched onto the quilt. Now it's time for the borders. And so I've got this cream color that I'm using for the borders because there's a lot of busyness in the print that I used on the center part of the quilt. I have 2 strips for the sides and 2 strips for the top and bottom. And so I'm going to sew the sides first and then the top and the bottom. So I am going to put a couple pins in just to make sure that both sides are identical. I pin the top and then I pin the bottom and then I just do a couple pins on the sides. And this one went together actually really well. Everything's fitting the way it's supposed to. So I probably could get away without pinning it, but I'm going to pin it. And I'll pin both sides. But I've changed the thread back to the cream colored thread. Got the 1/4 inch foot on, changing back to a straight stitch, and I'm using a 2.5 stitch length. Usually when I sew the outside border on, I do backstitch these because I'm going to be making the quilt sandwich and doing the quilting, and that requires a lot of manipulation of the fabric, and I don't want the seams to start pulling apart at those edges. So I am going to do a little bit of backstitching here. And the other side. Begin by pressing the way that you sewed it to flatten the stitching and set the seam. And then use the iron to press the border away from the quilt, and the seam allowance will be pressed towards the border as well while you're doing this. And repeat the process with the border on the opposite side. So the quilt top is finished, as this is the last time that you'll be working with it before it becomes the quilt sandwich with the batting and the backing together. It's also the time that you want to give it a really solid press so that everything's nice and flat and ready for the next step. I've been building my quilt sandwich here, and so what I have is the backing, and right now this is wrong side towards the quilt bat and the right side is on the bottom, and then my quilt bat, and then I have my quilt top, and the top and the backing have both been well pressed so that they're nice and flat, because once the sandwich is made you can never really press them quite the same again. And you'll notice I've got some extra fabric here. I like to leave approximately 2 inches or 5 centimeters around all the sides of the quilt, so that if they're shifting while you're doing your quilt stitching, there's room for that to happen without running out of batting there. And now I'm going to pin these all together, and I just use regular safety pins, but you can buy quilting pins that are a little bit curved. You should start pinning in the center of your quilt and then work your way out to the edges, smoothing out as you go, because you don't want any bubbles or ripples that could turn into tucks when you're doing your quilting. This is about the center of my quilt right here. And for this particular quilt, I am going to pin in about the center of each of the blocks, and then I'll do some pins on the border as well. So everything is pinned and ready. Just a couple comments about pins. Generally, I try to consider the quilting pattern that I'm going to be sewing so that I don't have to move a lot of pins while I'm sewing. And so if I was just going to be sewing around the squares here, this pinning would be fine. However, that's actually not what I'm going to be doing. So I'm definitely going to need to move some pins during the quilting process. You'll notice that I pin close to the outside edge, but not right on that edge. And I'll show you when I'm stitching the reason for that. The other thing I do when I'm done pinning is I like to turn over my quilt and take a look at the back to make sure that I didn't accidentally get a ripple in here. This actually looks good. So if you remember, I said that my blocks were meant to represent kind of earth moving up to sun and sky. And so I've decided to do a quilting design that will make that a little bit more obvious. And so here at the top of the design, I've got some clouds, and then I've got rays coming out from my sun, and at the bottom I've put in sort of hills and lines to represent that. And I've marked this using my favorite tool, one of my favorite marking tools, Pilot Friction Pen. And these are amazing because I can sew these lines and then I can just go to the iron and steam it and everything disappears. So now I am ready to quilt. I've got my lines here that I want to sew, and we're going to move to the sewing machine. I'm going to start by changing my sewing machine needle to a quilting needle. And quilting needles have a little bit more of a tapered design to them so that they will move more easily through the layers that are involved in the quilt sandwich. Now, do you have to have a quilting needle? I have done quilts with universal needles. Sometimes I forget to change the needle when I'm starting, and I found that a universal needle will do fairly well too, but quilting needles are designed to help avoid skipping stitches. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change to a walking foot. And a walking foot is designed for multiple layers of fabric so that it will move both sides of the fabric at the same time. So normally your feed dogs work from the bottom, and if you don't have a lot of layers, that works fine. But as you start getting thicker fabrics or more layers, sometimes the one layer will move faster than the other. So when you get to the end of a seam, you've got uneven edges. And in quilts, what happens is you end up with tucks on the bottom of the quilt, sometimes on the top as well. And so a walking foot is ideal. So like I said, my machine has a built-in walking foot, which involves me switching out the presser foot and this attachment here. But if your machine doesn't have one, and I have used machines that don't have a walking foot, you can purchase one. They attach similar to this. You have to take off the shank and the foot and attach them to your machine. And then with this one, I just raise my presser foot up and pull down from the back, and that brings the feed dog, which is the walking, from the top part of the sewing machine. I will use this walking foot as well if I'm sewing with fleece or other fabrics that are very thick, like a heavy wool or something like that, and I find it works very well. Now I'm going to start quilting. Now usually what I will do is start close to the center of the design and work my way out depending on what I'm doing. But for this particular one, the bird at the top, I'm going to use the blue thread that I used for the applique stitching. And so rather than switch threads partway through and switch them again, I'm going to start by doing the bird. Now the other thing I do when I quilt is I do change my stitch length. I like to quilt with a 3. I'm going to use my locking stitch again for this, and rather than back stitching, so it's less visible. And then I'm just going to stitch along the outside edge here. Now I'm going to switch thread colors. I'm actually just going to use the neutral thread that I used when I was sewing the blocks together. Oh, I'm not going to start right in the middle. I'm starting a little bit towards the bottom, but I'm going to start with one of my rows that outlines some of the ground or the hills. And again, lock my stitches. And I've rolled up my quilt here so that this end is out of the way. And I'm going to carry on and finish sewing all of the lines that I drew on the inside of the quilt. I finished sewing all the lines on the inside of the quilt, so now I'm going to work on the borders. I'm going to begin by doing a stitch in the ditch on the inside of the entire top of the quilt. I do different things with the borders around quilts depending on the width of the border in the quilt and how much time I want to spend quilting that edge. There are times when I won't do anything. This is a 4-inch border when it's finished. That doesn't have to have any stitching on it. It would be fine the way it is. But quite often what I do is just boxes around the quilt, and so I'm going to do that with this quilt as well. So I'm going to do 2 rows, keeping in mind that my seam allowance on the edge here is about 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters. And so in order to do 2 rows that are even, I need to go just a little bit more than 1 1/4 inches, pretty close to 3.5 centimeters. And that's going to get me pretty close to that 1/4 inch at the edge. And so I'm just making a mark there for kind of a starter point, but I'm actually going to use this quilting guide to help me line up so that I'm even with that. And because I like sewing this direction, I have to put this in, I guess it would be considered backwards, and there's an opening here that I can insert this in. There's my needle, and I just put this the distance that I want to sew from the edge, and that's how I measure it. Now if you wanted, you could draw a line all the way around, but that's what I'm going to do for my line. And I'm actually going to start right here rather than at the corner so that it's easier to turn the corner neatly and get everything lined up. So again, I'm going to lock my stitching, and then I'm going to be sewing these 2 rows of stitching all the way around the quilt. Now at the corner here, there's a couple things I could do. I could again use my seam gauge and mark, and then do a mark the other direction. Sometimes I just sew and pivot and just kind of maneuver until I get to the point for the corner. But I'll use these guiding marks today to help me out here. And then I'm going to check it by pivoting and see where this is, and I need to do 1 more stitch. And I'll just overlap a couple stitches here and lock. And sew the second row exactly the same as the first. Just 1 more step before I'm finished with the quilting of the top of this, and that is I like to do a finish on the edge that secures all the layers together and prepares it for binding. And for this, what I like to use is a 3-step zigzag. On my machine it's this number 9 stitch, and that comes on with a width on 5 and a length on 1. I'm going to change the length to 2, and I'm going to leave it on the 5. The 5 gives it a width of almost 6 millimeters, close to the seam allowance that I'm going to use when I sew the binding on. I just start at one of the corners. My foot is wide enough to handle this zigzag, so I put the edge of the foot on the edge of the quilt sandwich there, and you don't need to worry about back stitching on this at all. And then I just stitch. All the quilt stitching is done, and so now I just need to tidy this up before it's ready for binding. So I'm going to be trimming threads. I can take out the rest of my safety pins now because they're no longer needed. And I'm also going to trim off the extra batting and backing that was on the edges of the quilt. Now you could do this with a rotary cutter, and if you were thinking maybe that your quilt edges were not very straight, that might be what you want to do. But usually I just use my shears and trim along the outside edge of the quilt. Before I bind the quilt, I'm just going to take a moment to remove the friction pan marks on the quilt top. I'm just going to use a little bit of heat and steam, and those marks come off very, very easily. It's almost like magic. Normally when I cut binding, I would do on a quilt this size 4 strips, cutting across the fabric from selvage to selvage. But for this quilt, I decided I want to do something a little more decorative since my border is so plain. And so I'm taking several of the colors that are on the interior of the quilt, and I'm going to sew strips of those together in order to create a binding. And so for my binding, I typically will do 2.5 inch wide strips. So it's a narrower binding. It ends up being about 1/2 inch, 1.3 centimeters or so wide. And if you like wider bindings, you can cut wider strips. And because these are straight edges, we can do straight cuts. We don't need to do bias cuts for this binding. So that's what I'm working on right now. I'm ready to sew my binding together, so I'm going to remove the walking foot, and I'm actually not going to use it again. I could use it to sew the binding onto the quilt, but I find when I do the 3-step zigzag on the edge that really secures it, and that I don't need the extra feed dogs from the walking foot. So I'm going to go back to my regular foot. And for right now, I'm going to use the 1/4 inch foot because I am sewing my binding strips together. I want a straight stitch, 2.5 for my stitch length, and I'm going to take each of these pieces that I've cut and sew them together with a 1/4 inch seam. It'll take me a little longer than my usual bindings do because normally I'm sewing 4 pieces together and not something like 13 or 14 pieces I think I have here. And I am going to backstitch for these ones. Strips are all sewn together, and so I'm going to press these. Now normally in quilting I press to the side, but for the binding, I like to press these seams open because there's a fair amount of bulk when you're sewing binding with all the layers of fabric and the quilt batting and everything else. And so by pressing these open, it just creates a little bit less bulk at those positions. Now usually to save a little bit of time, the other thing I'm going to do with this is I'm going to fold it in half and press it. And so I usually press the seams and fold it as I go. And this whole piece is about 170 inches long, a little more than the actual measurements of the outside of the quilt, but you need a few extra inches when you do the folding to get around the corners on the quilt. I'm going to change from the 1/4 inch foot to the regular presser foot for my sewing machine. Now technically, the edge of this quilt was designed for a 1/4 inch seam. But when I do my binding, I like to do a little bit wider edge than that. I just find it's easier to work with, and so I use the regular foot on my machine, and I use the edge of the foot as my guideline. And this is just slightly wider than the 6 millimeters or the 1/4 inch. It's maybe 8 millimeters, 1/3 of an inch, somewhere around in there. And then I'm going to start by working with the back side of my quilt. And I've got my binding here all folded in half, but I unfolded it, and then I folded a diagonal corner on the one end. So basically you just take this corner here and bring it down to meet the seam, line up with the seam here. So we have this diagonal fold here, and then I'm going to fold it in half again. And this is going to make a very easy way to deal with when we come around the quilt and we need to match up the other end of the binding. I usually start at the bottom of a quilt somewhere, and I'm going to start closer to the side edge of the quilt, but not right at the corner. It's challenging to do a nice corner if you start sewing right at the corner. So I'm lining this up, and if you wanted you could pin this, but I don't usually pin these. And press your foot down, and I'm going to start, I'm using 2.5 as my stitch length, and I'm going to start as I usually would by stitching and back stitching, and I'm keeping the edge of the foot lined up with the edge of the quilt, and the binding is lying right on top, lined up with that edge as well. Now I'm going to stop stitching 6 millimeters or 1/4 inch from the edge of the quilt, and I usually just eyeball this, but if that's something you would have trouble doing, you could make a mark or put a pin to tell you where you wanted to stop, and then you need to backstitch. Secure that point. And what we're doing is setting up for when we wrap the binding around to the other side of the quilt. And then I'm going to rotate my quilt. So I have this binding that's going out beyond the edge of the quilt here. So I'm going to take the binding and I'm going to fold it so that there's a diagonal here, basically a 45-degree angle from the corner, and now it's going straight up towards the presser foot on the sewing machine. But I'm not leaving it like that. I'm now going to fold it down, and I'm keeping the top edge even with the edge of the quilt here. And what this is going to do is create a triangle here that is later going to be used to fold to the right side. When I start sewing, I'm going to start 1/4 inch from the edge, which is going to pretty much line up with my one where I stopped on the back, but this folded piece won't actually be stitched down at this point in time. So I'm going to lower my needle to make sure it's right where I want it. Get my thread out of the way here. And my bindings are lined up again with the edge of the quilt. I'm going to backstitch again. And then I'm going to sew up to the next corner and do exactly the same thing again. So I'm coming up to my starting point here, and what I'm going to do is trim this to right at this point right here where this diagonal meets my seam line here. And so I'm going to cut my binding right there. So this makes kind of a little crease there, and I'm just going to tuck this inside there, and if it's too long, I'm just checking the length here. I think I need to cut a tiny bit more off. So I cut a little bit more off. I'm not thrilled that I have a seam right close to where I'm doing this, but if I ripped this apart, what's left of the yellow is not quite long enough to finish it off neatly. So you're tucking that inside here, And then I'm going to catch that. I'm going to stitch right up and back stitch right on top of here. And so this will be tucked inside there. And back stitch. So now we're ready to turn this over and sew from the right side of the fabric and finish off the edge. So we're now going to be working on the right side of the quilt, and we're going to take our edge here, and I like to start where I finished, where I tucked that inside that fold. And I'm going to fold this over to the right side, and I'm going to be stitching very close to this folded edge right here. So I'm actually going to start a little bit above this. It's quite bulky right where that tuck is, especially since I have a seam there as well where those two colored fabrics were joined. So I'm going to start a little bit above and work my way up to it, and I'm going to back stitch on this. I do use regular back stitching on the binding rather than that lock stitch that I use on the center of the quilt. And then I'm basically going to stitch and wrap as I go. And again, if you wanted to pin this ahead, you could. Some people like to hand stitch this step, but I don't usually do that. I have done a quilt by hand, but I'm more of a machine person. And so most of my work's on the machine. So I'm going to sew up to the corner, and then I'll show you how you deal with the corner. So I'm coming up to the corner, and I just got out a little gadget I have called a Tailor's Awl, and I really like this for doing corners on quilts. You need to be holding the fabric and stitching with the needle very close, and so it's a little safer than having my fingers in there. And so I'm going to sew a little further here. And now what I've got is a fold straight down, and you can see how it does this diagonal at the corner. So now I'm going to keep that diagonal, but I'm going to fold this one straight up. And what that will do is give you this nice little diagonal line here, so you have this nice mitered corner. And I use my awl to hold that in place while I'm stitching. And it can go right under the presser foot, and the tip on it is pretty fine, so I even sometimes almost stitch over it, but you do have to be careful because if your needle hit it, it would break the needle. And so it's kind of like, you know, don't sew over pins, don't sew over your tailor's awl. But when I'm using it, I'm sewing very slowly and really watching, and I'm pretty good at controlling that. Now, just a comment about the folding. The goal of your folding here is to cover the row of stitching that you used when you stitched the back side. So I'm folding it just enough to cover that line of stitching. Now, if this ends up being too wide to nicely cover that stitching, you could trim some of this off. But if you sew accurately, it should be about the width that you actually want to fold over. And now I'm going to continue sewing. I don't have to back stitch or anything at the corner, and I'm going to finish off the entire binding. And we're coming up to where we started. You can see my thread ends there. I'm going to overlap a little bit and back stitch. cut my threads. Well, my swallow quilt is done, and this is the finished result. I hope the new owners will enjoy it as much as I enjoyed making it. And good luck to you. If you want to try this one out or make your own version of it, great, share it with me.